this is a deep dive. We're taking a deep dive into a methodology. It's a methodology specifically aimed at two things. One, how do you engage people such that they are willing to adopt pro-social behaviors, whether they be low-carbon lifestyles, resource-efficient lifestyles, disaster-resilient communities, livable communities, whatever term you might want to use for this. How do you actually engage people to do this? And the second is, once you have engaged them, how do you enable measurable behavior to change? How do you actually move the dial around the issues that you care about? So that's our agenda. And so what I'll be doing is sharing with you some of our learning and the research we've done over the last couple of decades in many, many cities across the country and around the world, and then inviting you to apply it to a behavior change and community engagement initiative, either that is already ongoing or is something you might wish to develop for yourself. And then we will be inviting you to build a strategy that you really start to personalize. Sorry about my my voice. Let me get something to drink. And then beginning to build a network to help you in the implementation. So that's our agenda. Before we begin that, I'd like to ask a few questions. So what is your major challenge as you think about engaging people with some type of initiative in your community that requires them to change their behavior? And if you are wearing the hat of a researcher, think about what is the major challenge in doing this kind of research. If you are a funder, what's the major challenge in funding this type of initiative? Or setting guidelines or evaluating. Okay. So I'd like to hear from you, because what I want to do as we go through this process is to target what I'm sharing to as appropriately speak to the issues that you are trying to address as I can. So can I hear from a few people what your challenge is?
Having time, both on my part and their part, to listen and engage in a discussion about this.
Fantastic. Could you give it to Jennifer, because I'm not sure everyone heard her.
Want me to repeat it?
Please.
Getting people to think about solutions beyond technological solutions.
Great.
Just to piggyback on what was said behind me, I wrote a permission and purpose to simultaneously have the space to reflect, to evolve, to strategize, but to simultaneously be intentional with an action in mind and to hold that space.
Great.
Getting support for well-established existing projects that are working well. We often find that funders and partners want new things. And when you find a good recipe, it's hard to create the sustainability for long-term support on that.
Interesting challenge, yeah.
Lack of leadership and support.
From above, yeah. So we'll do 3 more.
So a real challenge for me is our sense of time as a culture. And when we say something's going to happen in 2050, it's like, well, come on. But, I mean, we can't even lose weight in this country, right? So it just feels a little bit uphill just because of that, because we have a very distorted sense of time and the future and, I guess, the generations to come, maybe.
There's many things in that particular statement that we will need to unpack.
So we need a better definition and way of quantifying engagement that we know is effective and will actually result in changing greenhouse gas emissions and resiliency. And we need dollars for the asset mapping and volunteer training and the institutionalization of those programs. And what we need from funders is to help us with developing those tools for measurement and evaluation and asset mapping and training. And we need you to make them open source. We need you to not be worried about branding and connection, and because if we're going to move this fast, if we have an urgency to this, then we have to get our brands out of the way and get going with sharing resources.
Many points to digest there. Thank you. So 1 and then 2.
Okay, I have 2. Reaching the broad middle, as we haven't talked about, not just the choir. And then once engaged, making the steps to the deeper energy savings easy enough for the broad middle to act, which encompasses a whole bunch of things.
Great. Then we have one more hand back there. Thank you.
In Eugene, we've done some surveying about public attitudes, and we know that about 75% of the population understand that climate change is happening, understanding that it's human-caused, and understand that we have to fundamentally rethink how we do things. So the attitude is there, but the behavior's not following, and so it's that gap that's really kind of the tough nut to crack.
Which is a good segue.
Thank you.
Thank you. So fundamentally, what we see more often than not is that we're good at identifying the problems, and we have a good sense of the barriers for the most part, and we have people generally aware. Moving from awareness to behavior change is really where the rubber hits the road. That's the gap, and that's the place that we have begun our journey and have learned a bunch, which I'll be sharing with you and everyone else. But let me start with a story and then a video, and then we'll go into the formal presentation. So in 1999, I got invited by FEMA to take our methodology and help develop a national program that could have some way of preparing cities for the possibility of Y2K and the disruption that that might cause. And we built a program. We partnered with the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, International City County Management Association, and we disseminated it. And Y2K did not require much, so it didn't really need to do that much, but it was a great learning opportunity to take all of our work and put it in that context. But a few years later, 9/11 occurred, and 9/11 was a wake-up call around the issue of resiliency. And so the City of New York invited us to come and develop a program that we built out called All Together Now, which was how to create a disaster-resilient New York City. And we ended up working with all 5 boroughs, with about 43 different community organizations, with 153 buildings and blocks, and in every imaginable part of the city, from the most high end to many of the places that actually took hits during Sandy. So this is a video that I'll share with you that describes that program, but as much as describing that program, which was a culmination of many years of learning and many other types of programs that we developed, it starts to show this methodology. And it starts to show the methodology of what social capital generation, social resiliency, neighbor-to-neighbor connectivity in the context of behavior change. So where you have to have real performance objectives met, measurable behavior change looks like. So this will set up the kind of larger direction that I want to go, and then we can unpack that over the course of the day. So whenever you're ready.
The events of 9/11 changed everything. In the wake of a horrific tragedy, we discovered the value of support in a crisis, building community and resilience. Since that day, the need for emergency preparedness has taken on a new urgency. Terrorist attacks, energy interruptions, cataclysmic weather, or an avian flu pandemic. Despite the courage of our first responders, events of this magnitude strain the system.
If you look around what's going around the world, what's been happening with the weather lately, what's been happening with wars, we have to make people aware, and also ourselves, of what's actually going on in this world, and be careful and be ready to go.
So it's not just the big one, but all the other little ones that might be coming down the pipe.
Today, emergency preparedness doesn't mean waiting for help to arrive. In a large-scale crisis, it's likely that New York's first response capability would be overwhelmed. So that means that every one of us needs to be prepared. Prepared to help ourselves, our families, and our neighbors. Now there's a program that in an emergency can make all the difference to you and your family. It's called All Together Now.
911 made you think about a lot of things, and I started preparing myself right after that a little bit.
For me, this has been the first thing since 9/11 that's really concrete and informative.
It's too late in time of crisis to figure out what you're going to do, where you're going to go, who you're going to be with, and if you can set that up in advance and create a flow of communication and ideas and preparedness, it's all set in place for whatever happens, you're prepared.
Doing the All Together Now program is really one of the best forms of insurance you can have.
It has changed the way I think about being prepared. I never took it seriously, and I'm a nurse, but it's something, and I've been in the military, but it's something that you just don't think about when you're at home.
Scott Stringer is Manhattan Borough President.
This All Together Now program allows people to learn how to respond to an emergency. And we want to make sure that we have people prepared on every single street corner. And that's why I want everybody to attend the meetings, participate with your neighbors, and then you will be stronger for it, and our borough will be safer for it.
K.C. Goss, now in the private sector, was Associate FEMA Director for Preparedness in the Clinton administration.
It's the best thing I've seen across the world, and I've observed preparedness practices from the United States to Botswana. And the reason it is because it takes people where they are at the awareness level and raises them to the next level, empowers them to act now.
David Gershon is CEO of Empowerment Institute, the people who developed the All Together Now program. They're nationally recognized experts on behavior change and emergency preparedness.
What we're trying to do in New York City is create this resiliency. Resiliency is a powerful idea. It's more than just preparedness. It's the ability to respond skillfully, effectively, intelligently to a crisis. And people who are resilient are the ones that have the staying power to make it through whatever happens. So we're trying to build on this innate resiliency that New Yorkers already have and have demonstrated over the years on many crises and just daily living in the city, and turn that into an asset that is now more substantive.
Let's take a quick look at how the All Together Now program works. You're going to take a set of important actions that prepare you and your family to cope with different kinds of emergencies. The actions fall into three categories: preparing for energy disruptions, preparing for emergencies, natural disasters, and terrorism, and creating a resilient building or block. But you won't need to do this alone. You'll be on a team with neighbors from 5 to 8 nearby households. Your team is there to give you support and motivation to carry out the actions you choose.
The road to preparedness is fun. I mean, getting to know your neighbors is really fun. We call it All Together Now because you really do have fun. You know, you're in community doing these great things together. And
as the Red Cross says, you know, it's better to be prepared for an emergency that doesn't happen than to have an emergency that you're not prepared for. So, you know, go for it.
For people who can't invest the time right now, a streamlined version of the program lets them do it as an individual household, still with the support of a building or block leader. So either way, you're building the relationships and trust that are so vital in a crisis.
We helped each other through the actions. We formed a real team, and I know I can count on this team should anything happen.
We've got a great communication structure and a reliable, resilient relationship that I feel very trusting in.
Let's take a closer look at the team program. You and your team will complete the program in 4 meetings, one every other week. And you'll need to devote some time between the meetings to taking your preparedness actions.
Thanks for signing up at the introductory meeting we had a couple of weeks ago. And we're here today to discuss how we get started with the All Together Now program.
In your first meeting, you'll focus on building the team. Together you'll get to know how the program works, schedule meetings and support calls, and most importantly, create a support system for each other. This is what will bond you together as a team, and it's the key to success in achieving all the benefits of the All Together Now program.
When you have to look your neighbor in the eye, you really do want to take those actions, and you really do keep your commitments.
The people on my team made me accountable, so that in the past where I would have wanted to do something but life would have jumped in front of me finishing it, this created an accountability where I had to show up and say, yes, I did this.
The next meeting helps you prepare for energy disruptions by developing energy backup systems and contingency plans. After reviewing the program material with your team, you'll choose from a list of 12 actions, as many or as few as you like. These include stocking 3 days' worth of food and water, creating backups for phone service, cooking, heating, and light, even learning to help your kids adjust.
In the meetings, we discussed the actions we have to take in case of a power failure.
We practiced a night without electricity. We ate cold food and we ate by candlelight.
At the third meeting, you'll review the energy disruption actions you took, then jump into the next subject, preparing for emergencies, natural disasters, and terrorism. Team members create emergency evacuation and communication plans for their families, figuring out routes, emergency numbers, and places to meet if family members are separated. You'll even practice evacuation procedures.
We understand that quite a number of kids were lost during the Katrina hurricane, and it took a very long time to reunite them with their families. And that's something that we want to avoid if we can possibly avoid it.
Definitely one of the high points of doing the All Together Now program for me was creating an evacuation plan so that we didn't get separated, because after watching Katrina on the news and seeing children separated from their parents, that was devastating.
Other actions in this section include preparing for first aid and medical needs, preparing for fire or extreme heat, and ways to help people with special needs, and even your pets. There's also a section on sheltering in place. This is especially important in situations that may involve contaminated outside air. All these are actions that will help you, your family, and your neighbors respond safely and efficiently in crisis situations.
All Together Now, the great thing too, it was creative and it was fun. My kids got really involved. They feel more proactive. They feel like they have, some tools.
At the fourth meeting, the last in the All Together Now program, you'll review the actions for creating resilient buildings and blocks. Remember 9/11, how we all pulled together for support in a crisis? This part of the program builds that kind of connection and helps make our buildings and blocks stronger and better places to live. You can sustain the momentum by continuing to meet and take actions like volunteering to help your more vulnerable neighbors, and creating contingency plans for those who are unprepared. By building relationship-rich buildings and blocks, you're making investments that pay back in ways you'll see and appreciate every day.
It used to be this big fear that nobody really talked about, or you know, slightly get into it, but people were afraid to really enter, and it doesn't scare me anymore.
I think the danger I was encountering before all together now was that I was hoping for safety without doing anything. So now we actually know possibly dangerous things could happen, and we are prepared.
Just getting myself prepared now in the All Together Now program, I'm much calmer, and I don't have the fear anymore.
And it made me feel like I was a better mom, and it made me feel like a better friend.
Maybe I can help someone, and I can also, by helping someone, I'm helping myself also, and I needed that.
The All Together Now program is really great. It provides for the safety of my family, and it also helps create a resilient building so you have neighbors who you can count on.
So building by building, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, borough by borough, we can create a resilient New York City and become a role model for the nation.
So, all together now, New York City, all together now, America, all together now, our planet. Resiliency is clearly a driver that is forcing us to move from me to we. So let me move now into actually talking about what we're trying to do. So the title of this presentation, and really this way of thinking, is called Reinventing Our Cities from the Bottom Up. What we've been talking about over the last day is a reinvention process. Or if you don't think of it as a reinvention process, it is a reinvention process. We don't have the skill set in cities and communities for the most part to be able to get actual behavior to change very easily, to engage communities at this level. We have a lot of community groups that build the social capital, but then how do you translate it into the behavior change? And cities themselves, this is not a core competency. There is a model that I call Social Change 2.0. I wrote a book on it. And Social Change 2.0 is built on the premise of a second-order change worldview. So Social Change 1.0 is change through command and control, through financial incentives, and through social protest. That is the current, or legislation / command and control. That's the current way we think about how change works. It's institutionalized in our Constitution, legislation. Command and control / legislation, financial incentives, and social protest. When the nature of the problems we have to solve are incremental, that model has possibilities. But when we are talking about transformational change, where we actually now have to get 75% of my community to reduce their carbon footprint, and we've committed to carbon neutrality as a city, that's called transformational change. And when you start to look around at most social systems that are currently breaking down because they're not able to perform against the needs, the stresses placed on them, like climate change is placing on our multiple systems, but think economic system, think healthcare system, think education system. Every one of these systems is in great stress. So when a system goes into stress from a systems point of view, it starts to perturbate or become unstable. And there is a moment where a system can either break down and go into chaos if there is not an intervention done of any significant skill, or it can move to a higher level of performance and social value if the intervention can enable that. To enable it to move to a higher order of social value and performance requires what systems theory calls second-order change. The work we're doing today and what we have been describing so far is a second-order change intervention, nothing less than that. But that is not easy to do. That is the hardest thing to do. And we would never want to have to do it if we could get command and control to work, pass a law, or pay people to change, or protest and lament. But those aren't working. So what we're looking at now is second-order change. And it's hard, as Mitch laid out. It's very, very hard to do, but it is doable, and people want it. So we are reinventing our cities from the bottom up to create deep carbon reduction, neighborhood resiliency, and green prosperity. To Max's point earlier, if you get a demand-side intervention, you start driving change, desire for technologies. You start driving new markets. You start building green prosperity organically if you now have people wanting that. So we'll be looking at these strategies and tools for behavior change, community engagement, and actually taking a program to scale. What's the point if you can't scale it? So the starting point of our journey was asking different questions. We were not asking what's the problem and how do we fix it? We were asking the question, what do we want and how do we create it? And when you ask that question, you get a very different kind of answer because you're not defined by the problem, you're defined by your imagination. And so everything you see here is a journey of the creative imagination, not of me per se, but of the collective of people who were asked these questions, because what you will see is a co-creative process by carefully debriefing and learning from trials and error, which I call the social learning process. We were able to build these things. So another thing I want to build off that Max said and that Mitch said this morning was, what's the opportunity here for carbon reduction? So why bother getting people to lower their carbon footprint? Is there not an easier way? So here's the numbers. 70% of the carbon being generated on our planet is being generated by cities, according to the United Nations research that's been done. 50 to 90% of that, in Davis it's 68%, right in the middle, comes out of the choices we make for how we live our lifestyles, how we power our homes, our cars, the food choices we make, etc. So if we are going to have an impact on carbon reduction, this is where the opportunity lies. But how? How do we do this, given that the tool set that cities have are 1.0, and this problem is 2.0? So here's what the current box looks like from my point of view that most of us operate out of. And these are the things that I spoke to earlier. And the first is try to force someone to change, command them, pass a law. It's hard to legislate lifestyle change, so that's not a really effective tool. Pay people to change, financial incentives. Great if you have enough money to give people, but even as we saw with some of the ARA funding, you can give all these incentives, people still not taking advantage. The barriers are more than just people's resources issues. Awareness and information, to your point. How many of you know all the things you should do in your life but aren't doing? Can I see a show of hands? So awareness is not actually all that it's built out to be. Awareness is a starting point, but it's not enough. Information campaigns are starting points, but it's not enough to actually get behavior to change. And the last one is the most insidious and least understood in my judgment. I call it monocultural thinking. A single agency goes after a single individual with a single intervention solution required. It's top down. We want you to do this because we've decided this is the most important thing for you to do. and it goes after one individual at a time. And none of those things really tend to translate very well into behavioral change, or effectiveness for that matter. Because if you think from the point of view of the individual, they're not looking to do a retrofit. At best, they're thinking, how do I live a better lifestyle so I don't make a big impact for my children? Or how do I take care of myself in an emergency? They're not necessarily looking for the single solution. And when you have 35, like when we worked in the city of New York, we had 19 different agencies review this program, all of which had programs reaching out to the same household. That's a lot for the one individual to take in. So that's the box. That is what I call the current state of play in behavioral change. So how do we get out of the box? And what we've been looking at is when we use the imagination and we're not bound by the current solution set, we start asking different questions. So the first question was, what can we learn from natural systems or from evolution itself? What is the best practice we've gotten on this planet for how evolution takes place, or how we move a system to a higher order of performance and social value? And something really profound happened 850 million years ago. So give or take a few million years. And that was the shift from single-cell organisms to multicellular organisms. When we learned that the levels that were required to move to the next level of evolution of life on this planet couldn't be done by single cells, it required a different kind of mechanism. Multicellular organisms took off. And within a short, relatively by evolutionary period of time, it proliferated profoundly. My belief is, and Eric helped set it up last night, it was reinforced this morning, some of what you were talking about, Jennifer, is that that is one of the single most important things we can address from the point of view of dealing with climate change. Getting individuals connected, social resiliency, both from the adaptation and the mitigation. But that's just one clue. A second clue from social systems, can you believe 1 out of every 7 people on the planet is connected? That was my last, I mean, maybe it's even less now, by Facebook. What does that tell us about our desire for connectivity? A third clue. Anyone not know this quote? So our wonderful Margaret Mead. It's the small group that not only does it have the power to help create the peer pressure, peer support, accountability stuff that we heard about in that film, but it also has the wherewithal to be a driver of multiple other levels of change. So those are the clues that we built on. And over the last 23 years or so, we wanted to see how to, well, first of all, it makes it look very much like we had all these ideas. This has been a very spiral-like thing. We just had a lot of ideas and we just kept testing them out to see which ones worked. But this is effectively what we ended up doing, was harnessing this evolutionary impulse for greater social connection and the power of small groups to address the climate change crisis. So this is 2 years of mostly what didn't work and a few things that did work. The ones that did work are the ones I'm going to focus on. But if you want to know 20 ways not to invite your neighbor, I can tell you that. 20 ways not to organize peer support groups. Peer support groups may sound great, but there's 20 ways not to do it well. Mitch identified one of them this morning. So there's a real methodology from iterative learning. And one of the things that I think will be perhaps as useful to you as the content is the social learning process of iterating and refining, understanding what variable didn't work and why, making adjustments, and going on from there. So these were the 3 questions we set out to ask in 1990. How do we get people to adopt environmentally sustainable lifestyles? There was all this awareness and information, 50 simple ways, lists of things to do. There weren't quite so many websites, but now there are tons of websites. But how do you get them to actually adopt the behaviors was the first question. The second one is if they do adopt these behaviors, how do you get them to sustain it? Is this just a one-off thing with lots of recidivism like most behavior change? And thirdly, if you are able to get those first two answered, what will allow it to become scalable so you can have enough impact? Those were the questions. We had really little answers to work from. Those were just our starting points. We went off on an adventure. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is the framework that we began to use to try to answer these questions. And I explained what the Social Change 2.0 framework was, the strategy for second-order change, but basically has 5 key ideas that you'll see embedded in everything I'll talk about, and also that was embedded in the All Together Now program. So I want to make explicit what was embedded in the architecture. The first is Empower, Empowerment Institute. Our vision has always been to encourage people to envision and create what they want. How do you help people voluntarily envision new possibilities and go towards them? So it's very much about intrinsic drivers, envisioning possibilities, giving people the tools. How do you do that? How do you transform a system? How do you get people to transform from habitual behaviors to new possibilities, or neighborhoods, or communities, or an entire city? How do you build innovation? One of the things we learned was that the innovation that came out of these teams was profound. That's where most of our learning came from. How do you enable people to innovate so that they can come up with these new ideas? One of the things we learned in our conversations with the California Air Resources Board, who's now trying to figure out how to invest the $1 billion or so a year that they'll be getting from cap and trade revenues in California, is social innovation. To Max's point, they don't have really good ways to get from here to there. They have some ideas. It's going to have to be innovated. Mitch's point this morning, community innovation is critical. And then how do you get people to collaborate? 1 and 1 equals 3. How do you get synergy to happen? The work we did in New York City happened because we were able to get all these different groups to cooperate together. How do you do that? What's that skill set? And then lastly, how do you disseminate? How do you get the diffusion of a social innovation if you can't force people to change? How do you get that to happen naturally? How do you get innovations to be diffused? So I wrote a book called The Green Living Handbook. Karen, it actually I think was just called Eco Team at the time. It got renamed along the way. Karen unsuspectedly moved into a neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, and next thing she knew, a neighbor knocked on her door, and she was weighing her garbage and figuring out how much water to use or she shouldn't use, and she went on an adventure. So the program was designed to take the overwhelm of information and break it into topic areas that were modular. Solid waste reduction, energy efficiency, transportation efficiency, water efficiency, green consuming, and empowering others. Those were the topics, those are the areas where we have impact. And we created recipes, not just checklists, but specific recipes that showed people, here's the first step, the second step, the third step. Have you ever tried to cook from a checklist? I'd be curious what it tasted like. So recipes are actually how we move from to actually get from here to there. So we created the recipes, we created the checklists, and we were psyched. We had a program, the first behavior change program, but it didn't change behavior. It was well organized, it was accessible, but it didn't get traction. And so we went back to the drawing board. And we said, you know what we need from all of our learning around empowerment? We need a peer support system. So we created this idea called Eco Teams. And we created guidelines for how to run meetings, careful, structured meetings. And we integrated that. We basically would teach people how to use it effectively. And we got these results from 20,000 people who went through this. Yours is one of them, Karen. On average, people were saving 40% in their solid waste, 32% in their water usage, 14% in their energy usage. This is from pre and post assessments. One of the things along the way was that we went to EPA for some funding, and they said, can we analyze your data? And they did, and they said, this looks pretty solid. We didn't have max at the time, but we had some pretty good substantiation that this was pretty solid data, even though it was self-reported. And they saved $255, and without us even trying very hard, we were getting a 15% CO2 reduction emission. So the second question was, is the behavior sustained over time, or is there recidivism? And since we now had a program that was quite interesting to cities, many cities began to work with us. And they all wanted to answer that question, and so they did studies. Portland, Philadelphia, Columbus, goes on. But one of the studies was from the University of Leiden, because by now 22 countries had picked up on this program. And the Netherlands was one of them, one of the first countries in our planet to become, to the points we were talking about earlier, post-materials society, where they really are looking at how to get consumption reduced and change the worldview around that. And they hired the University of Leiden, and they had a 2-year longitudinal study. And what they found was after the program, 26 new behaviors were adopted. 2 years later, 19 of those behaviors were sustained. 7 of those behaviors were improved upon, and 4 new actions were taken. And their judgment was it was unsurpassed in changing behavior. What we learned was once you cinch the belt, it stays cinched because new habits are established, new systems are established. How many of you have gone someplace on vacation and you can't recycle? What's that like? It's hard. So you can understand why once these systems are put in place, they tend to stay in place. So we had a good answer to the second question. And now we had to face the third question. Was this just for the people in this room and your friends? Or was this for people who could actually go much deeper into the community? And so along the way, I met a guy. I actually didn't meet him. I met his book. A guy named Everett Rogers. Any of you know Everett Rogers' work? Great. So Everett Rogers is one of my heroes. Everett Rogers, social science researcher out of Stanford. He's no longer alive. And he had an area of study called innovation diffusion. How do you get new ideas or new innovations to diffuse? And he studied 1,500 case studies over 50 years and found patterns. And the patterns basically were that there were 4 groups of people that respond to an innovation. The first group, which I'm sure you all know, is called early adopters. And they have 2 characteristics: a high tolerance for experimentation, and they seek out the new. What he found was, though, that's very significant, is that if the innovation is capable of diffusing, and most are not designed well, and they die early on in the vine. To someone's question before about the process of building a social innovation, which is extremely hard work to get anything to work. So most don't make it. But if it is designed well enough, and if it gets to that number, you can hit a tipping point where it starts to actually diffuse on its own momentum. So what Rogers basically said is, unlike the social change mantra, don't preach to the choir, what Rogers said is you need to preach to the choir. The choir will sing loud enough to get everyone into the church. Go after those people who are most receptive. And they, by the way, are the ones who will get the next group. And it's interesting, in light of Jeff's research yesterday, that this early adopter population are called the alarmed. And there is a next group, which I'll get to later in his work, which is actually, you know, I am one slide ahead, I think. Where am I? I don't actually have that slide, so I'm just telling you off the top. I usually have that slide, which is called the laggards who never respond. But basically, it goes from early adopters, 15%. The next group he calls early majority, who are the belongers, the next 35%. The next group he calls the late majority, who are the next 35%, who come along when they have no choice or they'll be socially ostracized. And then you have the laggards. So this was a big deal. So now, where were we in our process? We were trying to figure out what is the best diffusion platform. And we started doing it through social networks, through faith-based groups, through service clubs, through workplaces, and neighborhoods. But when we got to the neighborhood, and it worked, because the peer support system and the structured program enabled all that to happen. But when we got to the neighborhood, we started discovering something we had never seen before. And that was that we had co-benefits. And the co-benefits were getting to know your neighbors and creating a healthier, safer block, livable block to live on, which were untapped in people's lives. There was a vacuum that if we could fill with skills and tools and the right approach, they would begin to act upon. We weren't sure if that was the case. So we began to do some research. We did focus groups around the country, and we asked them this question, and you can ask yourself this question and see what your answer is. If your neighbor knocked on your door and said, "Hi, I'm your neighbor from up the street. I'd like to invite you to a neighborhood gathering to hear about a program sponsored by the name of your city, to learn how to better conserve resources for the sake of our children, to get to know each other better as neighbors, and to create a healthier, safer, and more livable neighborhood, how likely would you be to come?" So here's what we learned from that focus group. 43% said very likely, 42% said somewhat likely. That is to say, 85%, well into the late majority, when they were invited to participate in their neighbor's house with those co-benefits, were interested. What actually happened was that the late majority, we were well into the 75%, said yes, half came, and when they learned about the program, the structured program and everything else, and they could trial it out, called trialability in diffusion of innovation, they had a way to test it, 75% joined. And we're getting a 25% recruitment rate in Portland, Oregon, but also in Columbus, Ohio. So this was not just for the green elite. It was across the board because of the co-benefits. And now what we're talking about with imagination is lateral thinking. We're not saying you'll save money. We're not saying this monocultural, do this one thing. We're saying here's a chance to get to know your neighbors, to conserve resources for the sake of your children, and to create a safer, healthier, and more livable neighborhood. And when we drilled down underneath those three things, here's what we saw. We saw that conserving natural resources for the sake of our children was meaning and purpose in my life. I have a chance to get a greater sense of meaning and purpose because I can do something for my children's future. I have very few things in my life that enables that. So we're tapping an intrinsic motivator. When we drill down to get to know the neighbors, we were tapping a need for and a dearth of community. Another intrinsic motivator that we were able to tap into. When we drilled down below safer, healthier, and more livable neighborhoods, we were tapping into self-efficacy. I may not be able to deal with climate change. I may not be able to deal with war. I may not be able to deal with the alienation between the haves and the have-nots on our planet, but I can make my block where I have some level of control healthier, safer, and more livable. So self-efficacy. And so we were tapping what was not tapped, but was available if one knew how to organize and architect the opportunity. So we, along the way, ended up partnering with one city, the city of San Antonio, who said, you know, this stuff looks really cool. We want to take this out into our neighborhood. We'd like to apply it to the issue of our city employees because we want to walk our talk before we want to get everyone out in our community to do this. And just as that was happening, the ARA funding was coming along, and we wanted to test out one piece of our program. How effective was it in enabling retrofits to happen? So we worked with the city. We ended up working with 19 of their 40 departments. Again, a very high level of recruitment rate from employees once they were invited by a fellow employee. We formed 27 teams. It took 16 actions, but here's the one that was most interesting for us to measure, which is that 41% of the actions, without really any prompting on our part, did some level retrofit, from weather stripping to changing out windows to full retrofits. But some level of retrofit was done. And we said, wow, this is very cool considering what we're hearing about the take-up of retrofits. Why? Well, one thing was that the team members were demonstrating it and they had the technical support available right on the team. A second thing was that, and probably the most critical, was that a sustainability ethic was established and a new social norm was established. This was now what we did as a team. And so it was a very important piece of our learning, and this is the police department talking. Our utility CPS gave out free thermostats and most of its energy to 78. The team was helpful to get people to do it. We also went to CPS as a team to take advantage of their retrofitting program around weather stripping our homes and putting in energy efficient windows. Most of our team took these actions. So a real opportunity there. The City of Philadelphia said to us, you know, this is really very exciting. Can we work with you on this program? And we took our program and it started to work. But they said, you know, this isn't really our problem. After a while, we started learning that the real problem was the high level, the white flight, the urban blight, the whole business, and these the neighborhoods that we heard about yesterday. And they said, could you apply it to helping us build more livable urban neighborhoods? And we said, let's try. And we took all the information and created a program we called the Philadelphia Livable Neighborhood Program, which dealt with neighborhood health and safety, beautification and greening, resource sharing, and neighborhood building. And we created it, we said, here's the deal. If you want us to work with the city, you city want us to work with these neighborhoods that you have struggled so hard to get traction in, we'd like to change the social compact. And the social compact is if we get them, because the neighbors were saying, we don't get priority service. And the city agencies were saying, we don't give you priority service because you don't sustain the actions and we have to come back next week or the second week. We don't have the money or the time. So we said if they were willing to prioritize giving them service and these blocks, by getting organized in this way, were willing to sustain it, would you give them that priority service? And you, community, would you be willing to sustain it if you want that result? So accountability. And they agreed. They all agreed. And so what we found was that we were able to recruit 101 blocks through this process. 63% recruitment rate, unlike 25%, because the immediate return on investment was so great. We were able to get, on average, 3 neighborhood improvement actions. We integrated through one platform, 25 different city or state programs. So it was one-stop shopping, and they took the action and took advantage of the program as they needed it. We were able to generate $4,500 in volunteer services. And part of what we also integrated was a low-income application of our program for energy efficiency, and we got a good number there as well. So that's livability. We got really strong feedback from the mayor and from the University of Pennsylvania about the efficacy of this model, and from our program manager. So last application before I go into real time was around disaster resilient communities. I shared with you that program, so I won't spend a lot of time. These were some of the numbers that we got from that program. And again, very positive feedback. So what have we learned from 23 years of research and development around behavioral change and community engagement? This is what we call the social DNA source code. And what we found was that many teams could be formed, but they wouldn't act effectively. But if that team knew what to do and followed the structure, and that structure came out of debriefing 5,000 teams what worked and what didn't, they would get consistently good results. 95% would complete the program and get the numbers that you saw, and many of them would replicate. So it became self-organizing because their success was strong. So these were the things that we found enabled that result. The first is the right size group. If you get over 8, as in 10 or 12 or 14, there's not enough social connectivity for it to really stick. So you've got to find the right. Under 5, there's not enough group dynamic to make it work. You can kind of make it work on both ends, but that seemed to be the ideal number that consistently got us the best results. The second is the structured learning program, the modularization and the recipe action. You can customize this. Every city began to customize it, but even a city customizing it is still top-down. A community group customizing it's still top-down. What allows it to work is the menu. So the individual household or individual block chooses the actions that they most want to take, that they haven't taken or whatever. So it gets very owned at the individual household or block level. The third point is what we call team development. So this is a group of people that never knew each other. Some neighborhoods we were on, most neighborhoods people didn't know their neighbors. They might know them by sight. They felt bad about that. But once they actually got to know their neighbors and formed a team, something began to happen when we started creating the notion of a team. We trained the leader. They had a purpose statement. The team had to come together and really align around a single idea of what their purpose is. So it's very intentional. They started sharing leadership responsibilities. So of the dozen ways not to do eco-teams, one of them is to turn it into like a teacher mode. Go and do this as a class. That doesn't work because there's no shared responsibility, no accountability. The fourth one is what we call the group process protocol. So there were structured meeting agendas, scripts, individual accountability to the group. So there was a strong understanding, to your point about process, of how to use process to drive action. Because if you left it to the group to figure out how to run these meetings, they were all over the place. There would be one person who would be taking over the meeting, or they had this piece of information, they want everyone to do this thing, or it goes on, or the meeting wouldn't start on time, or it wouldn't end on time. But when you laid all these things out and you built the rationale step by step, why each of these elements are there, and people followed it, it moved from what I call pseudo-empowerment to actual empowerment. Pseudo-empowerment is do whatever you want, go for it. Real empowerment is like a coach of a football team or a baseball team and says, here's what you need to actually be successful. If you want this outcome, here's how you do it. And then they would do it, and they would get the result, and they'd feel really good about themselves because they actually got the result. And the last is a performance ethic. So this is not a discussion group. This is not just a network of hanging out with friends or new neighbors, albeit you got all those benefits. We're here to lower our carbon footprint. We're here to make our neighborhood safer or healthier. We're here to build disaster resiliency. We're here to learn how to conserve resources. So that was important. The next was that there was a results orientation. We gave them feedback. We showed them where they were when they started. We showed them where they were at the end, and they were able to see a result, and it was measurable. And the last thing was this measurability, is that we had a baseline, and there wasn't just a sense of doing things. There was a real baseline. So that's the DNA. And one of the things that we learned was that we started tapping into what we call the adjacent possible, which are you go into one room and 5 other rooms open up. This wonderful book by Stephen Johnson, Where Good Ideas Come From, talks about this process of social innovation. And we discovered that we really tapped into 5 things as we did this. The first one was driving green jobs and green economic development. I want to live a greener lifestyle. I need the products and services. This drives demands for green businesses, which drive demands for green jobs. And we were seeing businesses lining up to get aligned with this program because we were driving them business. And one set of businesses started having the suppliers understand where they started using eco-teams as market research. And they started changing some of the production of what they were creating. The second one is social capital. We've talked a lot about that. We were prolific at generating social capital. At the time, we didn't really know what to do with it. It was a byproduct, really. But people were getting connected. They were cooperating. They were learning how to collaborate. We were building community. Again, Mitch's point, we were building this amazing platform. And the questions then were, how does one redeploy that? Now we have a lot of recognition of what we could do with it. The third thing was we were building a high-performance team. This was not just a group of people. These were people that were learning how to do visioning. They were learning accountability skills, facilitation skills, team building, problem solving. They were to get behavior change required a high-performance team, and that teams were becoming that. Implicit, again, the adjacent possible. And we were finding each team would start developing these ideas, like I want to figure out how we can all bike to work. So let's figure out how we can prepare our bikes, or let's figure out how to take our person who's never ridden their bike before to do that, or to the bus stop to take public transportation. They were inventing things all the time. So we were a social innovation generator. And many new businesses came out of those social innovations. Green entrepreneurs were spawning. This is Karen's slide. So what happened was that individuals would go through this program, and then they would volunteer to become a block leader. And then they'd be inspired. Maybe they'll coach the team, or now they'll become a political advocate, or maybe they'll take on being a social entrepreneur or a civic leader. One woman started out as an eco team, and she became mayor of her city, and she still is mayor of Issaquah, Washington. So you start out, some neighbor knocks on your door, and the next thing you know, you're the director of climate mind and behavior at Garrison Institute 10, 20 years later. And I asked Karen, is that taking too far of a stretch? And she gave me permission to say that. You can disavow it later if you wish. But I mean, that's what happens when you start actually the process. You've got environmentally literate or carbon literate citizens who want to go further. It's the demand side driver in the system. So along the way, the city of Portland, Oregon, being known for being, is our Portland person here anywhere? So this is a little before your time. You know Susan Anderson, of course. Oh, you were part of this? You were aware of this. Great. So Susan Anderson, who is their sustainability director, and a guy named Mike, remember Mike Lindbergh, who actually was the early adopter who invited us. Mike Lindbergh on the city council. Yeah, he's one of the guys who helped Portland become the sustainability capital. They said, this is a great program, the Green Living, but can you apply it to carbon reduction? We've got 1993, the first, 2007, they got a good head start on you guys. 1993, they created their climate action plan. They wanted to get 10% reduction in their carbon footprint, 10% reduction per household. Can you take this methodology and apply it to carbon reduction? We said, let's try. And we created the program. And the way the program worked was you create a baseline, your carbon footprint. We created one of the first carbon footprint calculators. This is 2000, really, 1999, 2000, so way before this thing gotten any traction. We took 24 actions, we put carbon numbers next to each of them so you could actually see what action created what carbon. We worked with the City of Portland's energy office to create really good numbers that were really scientifically strong. And we used the eco team, of course. Same model, the team building meeting, and then in this case it was behavioral change, and then it went into system change, and then empowering others to also participate. And along the way we developed a model which we call the community engagement model, called the Global Warming Cafe. And what we found was that given the numbers that we were trying to get of scaling a program, we wanted to look if we could find a way to get more at one time than just block by block. How could we get multiple block leaders at a time? So we created this idea where we started working on creating emotional investment in the issue, which was to help people talk about their fears and their hopes. It wasn't, here's the science, go change based on the deficit model. It was, let's talk about this, and you connect. How many are familiar with the World Cafe model? So this is the World Cafe model applied to this issue. This is a little bit like someone was telling the story the other day about they first they had a room for a certain number of people and it kept growing. We thought we would get 50 people. We ended up having to keep expanding the room until we had 250 people show up. We formed 22 eco teams in one meeting using this model. So Again, the small group process, again, process piece of the tool that helps move some of this stuff forward. We're going to be doing that later. In fact, that's being done right now. Keith, would you turn around, please? So Keith is a graphic recorder, and he's attempting, bless his soul, to tell the story that I'm telling in graphic form. And it's a very powerful way to capture ideas, and we'll be doing that later this evening for all your insights that you come away with. So that's what we see was happening there, trying to capture the ideas. And it's very kind of you to come and help us capture some of this. Greatly appreciated. And I said, Keith, where would you like to locate yourself? He said, well, if I stand in the front of the room, probably people will be watching me draw these pictures, so it may not be that good. And I said, I think that's true, including me, because I can't wait to see how this all looks in a graphic form. So what kind of results did we get? In Portland, they hoped for 10. We got 22%. 22% carbon footprint reduction based on this model of baseline. And again, it's soft in the sense that it's not looking at your energy utility bill, but hard in the sense that it's real numbers based on real behavior that you've changed, and a baseline that is real based on what you've entered. Instead of 25% carbon, not carbon, but engagement on a block, we got 41%. Why? Good question, but my hypothesis is because there was a lot of pent-up demand to address this issue. This was the next cutting edge for a place like Portland. We ultimately, along the way, bumped into Al Gore. 2006, the world awakened. Al Gore did his wonderful film and trained 1,000 evangelists. Are any evangelists here from that? And they started going out talking about climate change. And the first question they were always asked was, what can I do about it? And they said, do a low-carbon diet. And because they gave out the book to all these evangelists. And so the next thing we knew, we had 300 cities that were now wanting to apply this because there was such a need for personal action and community action. One of which was City of Davis. The program proliferated. 46 in California because California is an early adopter, and it took off around the world. But now we're in real time. We'd gone a mile wide and an inch deep. We were not getting it to go beyond just the 100 households or the first group of people. So it became very clear that we needed to think about how to take this to the next level. And it wasn't happening with the current capacity that cities and community-based organizations had. So, and by the way, let's just take a moment to honor Davis for being an early adopter. And they did their 100 households. They got 5,000 pounds, all these things that Mitch talked about. What does it mean to set up as a city a 75% recruitment rate of your citizenry to reduce your carbon footprint? What does that mean? That's like huge. And to be accountable for that. So Davis and Mitch and I have been on this adventure for 5 or 6 years. Because like any good early adopter, and if you follow the Silicon Valley rule, fail fast and fail often. So they were fulfilling that mantra. But if they fail fast and fail often, you get smarter if you keep trying things. But I realized that Mitch needed some help. Along the way, other cities in California picked up on it. We gave them more support. You could see the kind of upgrade in carbon reduction when you follow, in this case, there's real tangible things. You want to do it as well as you can, because if you can double or triple the carbon reduction because they followed the program structure better, it has real significance. They also achieved some very significant energy upgrade impacts, so we began to get some further data on that. So the big question, and this is real time now, is can you scale this? Can you take this to scale? What have we learned over our 23 years of doing this about scaling? And if you can scale this, you have a game changer. because of the impact of the individual footprint and the impact of cities' footprint. So this is the place we've landed. And we've identified that there are a set of what we call system conditions that need to be in place. And a point of view about whether you believe they're in place. So let me lay out what I perceive are the system conditions and why I think it is possible that we can scale something like this. The first is that there's a moral imperative. And again, I honor you, Bob, for really being the one to take leadership, to use the moral imperative to really get as far as we can on that path. So thank you. But it's not just a moral imperative. There's economic and social benefits that can be accrued. So you start to get some co-benefits and synergy. Secondly, the right time. How many effective carbon mitigation programs are you aware of right now? Or carbon mitigation strategies, not even just programs, that are actually on the ground producing results? There's a vacuum. We have a problem, Houston, but we don't have good sense of what to do about it. So there's a vacuum. We're looking for solutions that we're tapping into. This program has hard results. Households recruited, carbon numbers achieved, replicable methodology. So strategy. We think it's repeatable because it's designed to be able to be adapted into any community. And some 300 have taken on and gotten results. They haven't been able to get the traction for all the other reasons we've described, but they've gotten the results. So then the question is, what are the right communities? And we've concluded that there are early adopters who are looking for climate solutions that are bold, that are not just education outreach, check the box, put up a website, but actually trying to get the big numbers that are available. And our belief is if you can, you must. If you have a solution, any solution, you need to give it your best shot. And then what we call the right team. And we have seen many, many, many eco teams not really work well because they didn't deploy a methodology, they didn't use the methodology. And the teams didn't really master the process. Master the process means what worked, debrief. What didn't work, let's figure out why. What was the variable? So it's a commitment to social learning, a commitment to really mastering a methodology. And so those were we see as the condition, system conditions that are necessary for this to work. I think they're in place. And so we created a program, an initiative. We call it the Cool City Challenge. And its goal is to scale up this social innovation to achieve deep carbon reduction while building resilient neighborhoods and a low carbon economy in 3 early adopter California cities. Why California? Because AB 32 is there, because California is leading the charge, and we've concluded that that was where the most potential for diffusion could happen in the shortest period of time. And the ultimate goal of the Cool City Challenge, though, is not to scale up this social innovation per se. This is a stepping stone social innovation. The real goal is to change the game around greenhouse gas reduction and to move towards a viable path, and ultimately to create carbon neutral cities. That's where we're trying to go. So we're asking, what's the boldest question we can ask, given what we have as a tool, a set of tools? And we said, scaling up the residential sector and getting carbon neutral cities as the next step out of that. So these were the goals. 3 years, 25% minimum, up to 75% participation. We've already seen a city set the number 75%, 25% footprint reduction. We've already had many places achieve that. 40% retrofit, building off of what we saw happening in San Antonio. Green economic development, again, we've seen that happening. The more livable, resilient neighborhoods, the deep research so that we actually have a strong body of knowledge, so we have the business case to make around the carbon reduction and the cost-benefit analysis compared to other types of interventions. And then ultimately, Karen asked me the question, how do you scale this? And I said, well, very simply, we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. We'll establish these cities as teaching cities so that others can come to them. So we don't actually have to take the major startup costs and keep replicating them. So that's the vision and goals of the Cool City Challenge. The model is a whole system model. It's working in all the parts, all the community groups, the business community, and the local government working together. You can't get there unless you bring the whole system together. The demand side, the supply side, all the elements of a community. So what does it look like to go to scale from the point of view of this program with a city of 65,000, which is actually the number of a few cities that are actually in our finalist category, including Davis. So if you had a population of 65,000, it represents about 26,000 households, and you were trying to get a 25% household participation minimum, be 6,500 households. At 8 households per team, it's 812 eco-teams. And based on the global warming model or other things like that, we found that you could form, a group could form about 15 eco-teams a year if they were learning how to use some of these wholesale models. And if you divide 50 into 812, with 16 groups committing to 50 eco-teams over 3 years, you could begin to get some numbers like this. It doesn't have to be 16 at 50, it could be 32 at 25. But you begin to see how do you get a community manageable to achieve this with a baseline and ongoing feedback. There's a lot more to be said about that. So here's where we are in the process. We set up a selection process to find the cities. And Empowerment Institute sent out an invitation to candidate cities to apply after we did a lot of due diligence to see where we might find the best cities that we thought had the best potential for scaling in California. And we soon found that we were landing in Northern California because of the cluster effect as well. These cities were then asked to write a letter of intent to go through and really study the strategic plan and say, are you ready to work with this? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want it to be customized totally to your city, but you want to be on this adventure with us? And they said yes. If they said yes, then they wrote us a letter of intent. And then we said, when the finances are raised, we will then formally ask you to apply and build the case for why you think you can make this happen based on using the strategic plan, using the tools, adapting them, of course, to your city as you need to. And then there would be a competition based on the scalability success factors, and then we'll select the 3 cities. So here's where we are. These are the cities that are in the finalist category based on those criteria. They are your early adopters by far. And in Sonoma, it's the city and it's the county and it's the Sonoma Ecology Center as a joint applicant. And these are our research implementation partners. So along the way, we knew that we had to build a strong body of research underneath this. So we're working with Max and his team at Lawrence Berkeley. We're working with Carrie Armel and some of her folks at Stanford. Some of you may know her work around behavior change research. We're working with Chris Jones and other people at UC Berkeley. We're working with the Energy Efficiency Center and Ben Finkelor at UC Davis, and Karen at Gershon, and the World Wildlife Fund is helping us at the later stages disseminate. Kay and I have been having a lot of fun looking at how to collaborate on that later stage. So this is our implementation first phase, which is that we select and prepare the cities. And here's what we're doing. This is what it looks like on the ground. We're integrating, so this program deals with carbon reduction, the key green living needs of that city, whether it be water conservation or some other issue, the ability to customize, the ability, so we integrate all the programs, livability issues and the resiliency issues. Are many of you familiar with all of the research being done around gamification? So gamification is a powerful new puzzle piece. And so we're beginning to use the actions and the levels of the program and be working with some folks from SAP who are really, really smart around gamification and other places to really figure out how to maximize the gamification impact of this. It's a natural for gamification. Not only that between the individual households, but the blocks, the cities, and so on. And then, so from our point of view, the programs are a software system. They can be customized in multiple ways. They can be tweaked. Every software, every program we plugged into local resources to maximize its optimization to be effective and to make it locally relevant. The community engagement strategy we see as the operating system. And so we then want to build this technology information management system to aggregate the carbon, to keep track of participation by block, by sector, by city, to simulate the results at different levels of scale, and to make the linkages with local resources and the local groups that get plugged in and get more members, and then for how to do project management. And then we take it to scale, and then we change the world, and we have a lot more fun not having to worry about, do we have a plan? Well, I would hope. But here's what it actually looks like when you start to see this vision play out. So what might the 21st, coming back to my first slide, reinventing our cities for the 21st century, what would it look like? What might the 21st century look like when citizens are living environmentally sustainable and low carbon lifestyles in resilient and livable neighborhoods? That's what we are trying to envision and create. As I mentioned, the empowerment worldview is to help people envision and create what they want in their lives, their communities. So we have to be able to see it to be able to create it. So what does it look like? What might it look like? So one thing is that neighborhood teams are a lasting solution. Again, Mitch made this point. You build this platform, and you can redeploy the social capital to multiple issues. Neighborhood teams support each other in making these behaviors. And you discover behavior change one household at a time. Households lower their impact on climate change and learn how to conserve resources for future generations. And you start seeing different kinds of behaviors showing up. And this starts to have different impact. And you start to see cool blocks emerge. And now we're working at the scale of the block. Very, very powerful level. The unit where we have the most impact, where people most want to connect. So sustainable and low-carbon behaviors quickly become the new norm. We start changing the social norm on a block. And sooner or later, you have cool blocks. Empowered and connected households on a block beginning to work together for change. Block gardens, feed families. Block compost, fertilize gardens. Swaps, save households. The collaborative consumption model. Car van pooling to get to work. You start to see this come alive. And now you start seeing resiliency showing up on blocks. They're able to have greater safety. They're able to deal with vulnerable households. They're able to respond to emergencies. They're able to adapt to climate change. So resiliency starts showing up on cool blocks. And then cool blocks multiply. And the next level out is what we would call eco-districts that arise from this. And you start having demand for teleworking and green energy and local food and different ways to work with transportation. And this starts driving demand for entrepreneurs and leaders that respond to this opportunity for local businesses and co-working centers and green energy co-ops and edible trees in the district and startups that start catering to a sharing or a low consumption, high quality of life economy and world. And then you start moving into these eco-districts and all of what starts to happen with them, carbon offset markets, citywide sharing of economy reduces waste and hyper-consumption, and it goes on. You can fill in the blanks, because each city will. And you make a city that's healthier and wealthier. They're able to conserve resources. You've got citizens that are now engaged in these new ways to care for themselves and their community. You've got reduced demand on services, freeing up, it goes on. you can fill in the blanks here, but you basically are now moving us into what we envision is possible and can be possible if you can get this to happen at the scale. And then you have a future that we all want. And let me close with this quote from Riquet. Again and again in history, some people wake up, they have no ground in the crowd, they move to broader, deeper laws. They carry strange customs with them and demand room for bold and audacious action. The future speaks ruthlessly through them. They change the world, which is really our job assignment, our job description. So with that said, let me take a pause. Thank you for your presence.